Hi, I hope you guys are having a great conference so far, and thank you so much for coming to the talk. I also want to thank the conference organizers and the sponsors for inviting me here. This is my first time in Poland, all the way from San Francisco, so I hope the jet lag doesn't set in until about 4:15. To give you a little bit of context, like Magdalena mentioned, I have been a designer at Airbnb for about a month, so there's not a lot to report yet. But instead, I'm going to draw from my experience in the past 5 years working at IBM. I was creating, measuring, driving the adoption of, and evolving the design language system there. But before I get started, I want to know a little bit more about you. So raise your hand if you work at a company that has a design system. Okay, just a few. Raise your other hand if you've ever contributed something to a design system. Okay. Now, do the wave if you think that design systems are going to replace designers. Okay. Well, I can't make any promises, but let's see how this turns out. So I'm not going to go too deep on this topic, but I do want you to have a baseline for what I mean when I say design language system. So I define design language systems as a set of standards. You think of things like principles, guidelines for patterns, interaction, motion, that operationalize. So essentially a set of standards that put into action different ways for how we create and interact as designers or end users with different things in the world, which could be services, other people, or technologies. What I love most about this definition is that it doesn't talk about the parts of a system as much as it does the people that it serves. And the important part here is that design systems parts are not the point. Don't be fooled. Just because someone makes a component doesn't mean that they've built a design language system. The reason why designers and engineers need a system is because if there isn't one universal standard that covers as many use cases as possible, then the creators, they lose valuable time, and to the business, obviously, this means money, making more and more components that look and work slightly differently from each other instead of focusing on more impactful designs that touch the end user experience. So this is a great example from a GitHub design system manager who says that she would rather have her GitHub designers think about how to make project management easier for developers, PMs, and designers in all different kinds of companies. So having designers focus on answering bigger questions. Now, on the other side of this, design systems are really useful for the people that we serve and who essentially need systems because they develop familiarity and relationships and mental models with the things that they use. Obviously, like this lovely copy machine, if these objects, people, and environments don't live up to people's expectations or they start changing without notice, people can quickly become lost, confused, desperate, or even frustrated. So first, now that you have like a baseline and a definition for what a design language system is, I'd like to talk about the first word in design system, which is design. How did design get started and where is it going? So if you have a notebook or a phone, I'd like you to take that out. It's time for your design history pop quiz. No cheating. Okay, question 1, who designed the Nike logo? Anyone? Anyone? Okay, you could cheat if you want. Surprise! It was Carolyn Davis. Now, that was actually just a trick to get your brain switched on, but since it's active, I'd actually like to walk you through a few other design activities. So logos like Carolyn's remind me of the time before World War II, back to a well-known little design school called the Bauhaus, where design was a combination of crafts and fine arts. The goal was to achieve a total modernist work of art through the way that something looked and worked. And these people look incredibly focused. Even in the way that they are dressed, you can tell that aesthetics mattered. The Bauhaus really started defining primitives like color, shape, line, layout, typography, and the beginnings of treating form as image. Now, if we move on to the next era of design, after World War II, there became this laser focus on optimization and speed. No surprise in a post-war era. The goal of design was not to question whether something should exist, but instead to make everything that already existed new and improved. So this led to functionalist designers like Dieter Rams, who became rock stars of industrial design. The focus was on a man, most of the time, and his machines, and we valued a culture of authorship and individual style. So now I'd like you to channel your inner Dieter Rams and take a minute to design the perfect record player. So if you have something to write with, or if you just want to think about this in your head, take a second to consider designing a record player. I'll give you about 30 seconds to do this. What would yours be? Could you improve on Rams's amazing machine? Okay. So while you're thinking about that, now I want to move on to the third wave of design. So raise your hand if you ever took a class in something like color, layout, type, wood shop, metal smithing. Okay, that was almost everyone. Then you know and are very familiar with this third era of design education, which basically treated design as separate mediums, almost like they were the meat, potatoes, and dessert, which you didn't want touching each other on the plate. This is really the time period that created silos within the design disciplines. And in this situation, the emphasis was on formal investigations, essentially looking at the nature of the mediums themselves, the goal being to push the boundaries of their limitations. So now I want you to think about that record player you designed and consider a new way to experience music. Think about in your mind what other things you would come up with if I changed the prompt on you. So instead of designing a record player, you're designing a better way to experience listening to music. Give yourself a few seconds to kind of think about what that could be. Okay, since you all are a little quiet, I'd actually like you to take a couple minutes and talk to somebody sitting next to you about what experience, designing a better way to experience music might be like, better than the record player. So take a couple minutes and just discuss what that might be. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to wrap up here. Now, some of you might have noticed that the second exercise, in the second exercise I just gave you, you didn't have a prescribed object or solution given to you. This meant that you had to think of someone who you'd be designing for and define the intent behind the outcome. It was more open-ended, which means that you would be technically designing in the fourth age of experiences as a mediator. Now, companies in this age create new products and services like the iPod or Spotify, which were successful because they focused on how people wanted to engage with music differently. For Apple, their goal was to give people 1,000 songs in their pocket, with iPod serving as a whole new mediator between you and your tunes. So, the most recent wave of design comes in the form of designing as a facilitator between not just one person and their music, but many people, environments, and technologies, which I'm sure many of you are all too familiar with. And we've come all this way to finally arrive in our history at the need for systems. On the left is the opposite of what designing for facilitation looks like. The truth is, we probably don't need one more chair to buy and passively consume. Instead, these more messy diagrams, like the one next to me, are needed to explain the complexity of systems. So this one up here shows how a Flickr user engages with the photo sharing platform. It answers really big questions like, what happens to my photos once I post them to Flickr? Who has the ability to view my photos? And how can I control the privacy settings of my photos? I hope that by the time that I'm done with this talk, you'll be convinced of why we need 1 million more of these diagrams instead. Now, the reason why looking back at design history is so important is so that you understand how this statistic is now a reality. According to the United States Bureau of Labor, they estimate that we've reached the limit in the marketplace for more job creation in graphic design, which means that user interface design and visual communication are no longer the things that make the majority of US designers essential to the companies that we work for. Now, on the other hand, designers working on systems or end-to-end user experiences that the US Bureau calls networked communications, as well as jobs in software development, are skyrocketing. 7% is the average growth for any industry, and right now, these jobs are growing at the rate of 27%, with 186,000 jobs in software development, which is enormous. So one question is, why is this happening? One of the things that's going on is that there's currently a lot of visual design decisions that computers can speed up the process of making. Computers are really good at answering the what and the how. There's been a lot of really interesting studies and prototypes done in many in-house companies to look at how computers can already lay out designs, automate viewing components in context, making suggestions for primitives like color, type, and icons. They can even use machine learning to help teach people how to use the system. Most recently, I saw an interesting case study where a designer and an engineer got together and built a small app that basically allowed anybody who could do a whiteboard sketch to upload this sketch and basically map each of the components to the drawing style of that sketch so that it could immediately translate into a set of user flows. Now, on the flip side, the computer also has some weaknesses. They're not as good at answering questions about the who and the why. And in the future, there will be a need for a more general set of skills that cross disciplines like business, psychology, and technology that designers will obviously need to be more equipped with. These who and why questions that we have a lot of strengths in are things like synthesizing qualitative research, creating design systems that are inclusive of many different people and walks of life, including accessibility and globalization, developing a design system philosophy and design principles, and knowing how to evolve and drive adoption of a design system. All of these different pieces are, as I mentioned in the definition of a design system, important because there are designers, engineers, and different end users that actually use and benefit from a design system. So understanding human motivations is something that we really have an edge on computers in right now. So today I'm going to spend some time going a little deeper with you on some of the softer skills of design language systems that can equip you with different ways to think about adoption and help you understand why developing a philosophy for a design system is so important. This is the design language that I worked on and started in 2014. And I'm not going to talk too much about the details of how it was created, but I do want to give you a sense of the scope. So it's important to know that our design language was initially meant to serve 1,600 formally trained designers in 44 countries around the world, making over 1,000 different software products. And after we released our set of standards, we used a variety of different research methods to evaluate the adoption of our system. Now, it's important to know that, you can automate some checks and evaluate whether or not people are using different parts of the system through, different coding processes. But we also wanted to make sure that people really felt like they wanted to use it, that there was a desirability to it, and we wanted to understand the human emotions behind the system. So we reached out to our global product design population to do things like surveys, focus groups, shadowing designers while they were working, active listening in our Slack channels, and interviews, as well as competitive analysis. So we came to the realization that sorry, just one second. We came to the realization that designers and their teams were implementing our libraries, but we were trying to figure out things like awareness. Do people even know that the design system exists? Their understanding of it, what their perceptions were, and their own needs and behaviors, so that we could actually establish a baseline for what a healthy design language practice was. So this was kind of what our adoption framework looked like to measure success. We asked ourselves things like, is a design language system that we have better than the thing that came before it? Is it consistent with the values of the culture? Is it easy to use and understand? Can people experiment with it? And are we seeing people actually practice the design language system with success? So for the first one, is it better than the current state? The answer was a pretty easy yes. We had about 80% of our product teams applying the design language system within a year after its release across 15 different management chains. And that didn't require an executive mandate. Instead, people were choosing this over as a popular preference over other systems that they could have adopted. Now, this was the UI pattern library on the left before the design language system in 2014, and this was the design language system that we created after. And some of the pros of this was that we were able to move design basically into existence. As you could see on the left side, most of our software products looked more like a Craigslist ad or just not designed at all. There was one rigid coding framework. Everybody had to use the same programming framework, and there was a plug-and-play environment where developers could cut designers completely out of the process and just make flows themselves. And we moved that with our design language system to a more modern software design with modern development frameworks, and this required a dependency between design and development to work together in the open so that they could make the design language their own. There were a lot of patterns of positive adoption, like when designers would tell us that there wouldn't be a day that goes by without them having it open. But overall, the focus on visual design, user experience design, and brand personality were 3 critical factors that increase the reputation and the external eminence of our design program faster than any product that we could ship. And really, the design language system that we created also signaled a human touch in our work. One surprising tweet came from Apple evangelist John Gruber when we open sourced our design language. He said, "Words I never expected to write, elegant, thoughtful design guidelines and examples from IBM." Now, IBM traditionally was not known as a design-driven company, and before we hired 1,600 designers in the past 5 years, there were roughly maybe 100 at the company overall, and the company is over 300,000 people. So that was really a drop in the bucket. It was great to hear the feedback was positive from the external community. The next adoption question that we asked ourselves was, is this design language system that we created consistent with the existing values of our product design culture and of IBM as a whole? So IBM really prides itself on being accessible, global, really essential to people, expressive in its character, and experiential in the way that you engage with it. And one reason why people really preferred the design language was because we baked accessibility requirements into our guidelines, our color palette, and our code libraries. We also created a companion accessibility handbook, which was a quick reference for designers, product managers, and developers to understand their role and responsibilities. One example of our global approach to creating the design language was our process for icon recognition testing. So while we were creating our iconography, we would create test prints and send them to our studios in Singapore, China, Mexico, Germany, without any labels written underneath the images. We would ask designers to print them out, poster size, and have people in person and remote write down what they thought the icons represented. It really helped us check our bias and make sure that we were aware of the variety of cultural contexts where icons would be used. This, for example, led us to give more guardrails around the usage of the eyeball icon, which in Middle Eastern cultures, for example, a single eye can be perceived as a sign of evil or contempt. So all of those details matter. We also strive to be essential to the people that we serve by providing value and removing only all the parts until only what's necessary is there. So whether that means a mobile email client or an immersive data viz, everything is clean, organized, and prioritized. In addition, we care about being expressive. Our colors are global. We like to make sure that we respect the heritage of the 100-year-old brand and connect different touch points. So from weather channel data visualizations or large-scale commerce platforms and task management tools, these are little mood boards that we would see product team designers creating. We were observing in the adoption of the design language system people expressing in bold new ways that really signaled that they understood that good design is good business across all touch points for the people that were using our products. And lastly, the last principle looked at wanting our products to feel experiential. We wanted people to be able to explore, to be enlightened, to interact, and make progress through using the products. So one case study that highlights this is the creation of our custom data viz guidelines. And these guidelines were basically meant to help IBM designers who work on software that takes in very large data sets in healthcare, finance, commerce, ranging from anything like climate behavior, and representing those in rich interactive ways that basically help lead people to new insights. So instead of users pouring through reports and data tables, we wanted them to be able to compare, overlay, and zoom in and zoom out of information. So for example, we took inspiration from one of IBM's original 1970s posters and the natural world to develop a unique flower chart diagram that looks and feels like IBM, but is also innovative and useful to see and compare different kinds of data sets. And in coming up with new ways of seeing, we also did a lot of sketching around asking ourselves questions like, how does IBM represent the future with data? So we explored new patterns, textures, and layers that could elegantly represent a forecast. And we looked at different symbols of forecasts that could indicate the predictive strength or likelihood that a particular scenario might happen. So that led us to create different prototypes, using our existing products, but bringing in new data visualizations, and using constraints of bar charts, simple line charts, that people were already familiar with to build out the idea of what a forecast could look like. The next adoption metric that we looked at was complexity. Is this system actually easy for people to understand and to use? For us, this piece was not as successful as we'd hoped. Like I mentioned, we built this self-service website where designers had to do a lot of instruction on their own. And because the design language was so open and flexible, it kind of felt like a bunch of guidelines being thrown from an ivory tower without any infrastructure in place to build ongoing trust and communication with the designers who were being asked to use it. So once we launched it, I was the only person who was responding to everyone's questions and needs. And teams went in and filled the gap of our design language by making more guides that they also called design language systems. Conway's law says that any organization which designs a system produces a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So to see this in action, here's the way that IBM software groups were organized in the business just a few years ago. And this website is a set of all the business unit specific design guidelines and systems that were created within a year after we launched the design language. So once you built one, everybody else built one too. And this meant that we had 23 designers working on 6 different component libraries, coding the same drop-downs and radio buttons over and over again. They knew that each other existed, but they weren't collaborating, and many times in the same building, and this was costing IBM $3.2 million year over year. Trialability. Can you experiment with it? So for us, we really allowed for a lot of experimentation with designers, but developers had less success. So we'd see this experimentation through events that teams would host, like an in-house panel or a science fair in our open studio space to cross-pollinate best practices of design systems and play with each other's examples and websites. In addition to that, we also built a culture of critique by creating a set of guidelines as well as bringing in a third-party tool called Wake into our ecosystem so that designers across all of those different business units were uploading different work and giving feedback to one another. We could tell that we were having trouble with our developer community because we weren't providing any code examples to go along with the design language system, and they were experiencing a lot of pain by not having any way to reference the designs in implementation. Lastly, we looked at observability. So did we see other people practicing with success? And the answer was yes. The designs, for example, on IBM.com were better than they were before, but they weren't necessarily unified. And one of the issues that we ran into was that when we looked at our design population, the skills that kind of fell along different disciplines like front-end development, visual design, they were much smaller than those who were self-disclosed user experience designers, which meant that with few craftspeople spread thin, we had an uneven distribution of adoption. In addition, designers were embedded in many different functions in IBM. So some were working in the corporate brand space, the innovation office, Some were working in the marketing teams. So it was hard to reach all of those different people and give them the same level of attention. In addition, we had what I would describe as a design leadership ripple effect, where if you look at those concentric circles, the leadership was pretty small, and they were responsible for driving and guiding and educating all the designers, making sure anyone creating content was doing that in a way that looked and felt like IBM, and making sure that all of IBM understood the value of design, and then making sure that the people that we served were actually having a great experience. So there were too few leaders and too many responsibilities, which contributed to a challenge in people practicing with success. And then lastly, I don't know if any of you have experienced this before, but within our population, we had a small group of designers, even though 1,600 seems like a lot. But compared to the rest of IBM, there were also many, many other people and many other disciplines creating and designing content. And as you kind of looked at that, the skill levels needed to adopt the design language were high in the design population, so you wanted to give more flexibility in the guidance itself. But for the rest of IBM, you really wanted more constraints, and the skill level was not necessarily as high in the execution or production of design. So there was always that balance between the two that we were trying to straddle. So as you're doing adoption research in your design language systems at any company that you're at, just keep in mind that nothing is invented and perfected at the same time. Then I want to just touch really quickly on this other point. So one thing that was really valuable from my lessons at IBM, and I've noticed that this is something in design language systems that's been missing, is the need for a design language system to have an underpinning philosophy, not just a set of principles, but a purpose that drives all the design decisions. So this means that at IBM we spent about 6 months really investigating what the philosophy that could really only be IBM's, because it ties back to our unique story of how we evolve and what we do for people, really is. And the way I would describe a philosophy is a system of thought that you build before the pieces and parts that come after it. So if you look here at the left side, that's kind of what IBM looks like now. Great intentions, but aimed in many different ways, which creates different silos. And we created a design language, but we had to evolve it to make sure that we could have experiences that were more like what's on the right. So we built our philosophy first after the second version of our design language. It was actually our brand team that pointed out this need for a philosophy, and it was because we collaborated in an interdisciplinary way that we really found how important that was in retrospect. Those philosophies connect to a set of principles that, when paired together, build the character of your design system. That really drives the aesthetic and the purpose. So one thing that was really important at IBM was that we had this history of man and machine. So there's always this idea that it doesn't matter how big or small a problem is, IBM has always been working on helping people and augmenting what they can do through the machines that they create. So, we have this man and machine motif in our 1970s kind of heritage all the way into 2018 when IBM researchers are in the labs building quantum computers from scratch. Another important theme that we looked for was teaching, learning, and research. So this is something that emerged from looking at what's always been true about the IBM brand. So we've always been known, it's IBM's slogan, to think. And in addition, we also have been teaching, even today, in New York, there's a program called PTech that students have that helps them place them into STEM jobs in New York City, and it's actually expanding to other countries and cities around the world. So again, it's the mankind and machine theme, the teaching, learning, and research theme, and then this idea of building partnerships that's always been true about IBM. You've seen that, IBM partnered with NASA many decades ago to send a man into space. And now we've been partnering with Apple to build enterprise apps to help pilots more safely and easily fly planes. So all of that is done through this idea and continuous momentum of progress and partnerships. We kept feeling like there was something about what it means to understand that you can't do something alone. And Paul Rand, who designed the famous IBM Rebus that you've seen on the website with the I and the flapping B and the M, has a great quote that the study of design is actually a study of relationships. And so we designed IBM by focusing on that. And that's how we came up with our philosophy that we called Duo. So essentially, once we came up with this idea of duo, of partnership, of progress and teaching, this idea of mankind and machine moving forward to the future, we had a philosophy in place for which we could build a system. And systems, obviously, are made up of other smaller subsystems that have relationships and that contribute to the understanding of why whole systems make sense. So the first atomic piece of the system we looked at was typography. This is IBM Plex, the new corporate typeface. It comes in a sans serif and monospace, and in other many different global languages, which is beautiful. It also needed to be laid out on a grid. So we built the grid, no surprise, on relationships of 2, different multiples of 2, 4, 8, 16, and 24. So you can kind of see how those components grow to those different sizes in a responsive environment, as well as using them for our vertical rhythm and spacing. And then for different ratios and proportions that we would choose for things like photography on the website. And we moved our color palette forward. Again, this idea of blue being essential, something true to IBM. The duality of that, mixing our blue that has always been kind of IBM's blue suit, mixed in with all of our other colors. So the palette that you see here has a little bit of blue mixed into each one of those colors to give them an overall cooler feel that would be instantly identifiable. Lastly, we built an icon set that really matched the kind of 90-degree engineered and precise interior angles of the typeface with those more natural and organic rounded exteriors that really, again, harken back to that man and machine quality in everything, so that they felt like they were a complete family. We wanted to bring this same harmony and thinking into our motion design guidelines. So we started looking at, different kinds of motion that could feel very productive and help people think that they were getting their jobs done faster and more efficiently, while at the same time bringing in some motion curves that were more expressive and emotive. And then we also brought all of those different primitives together into our components. So you can kind of start to see how these components began to have that illumination in that light and energy from the color palette, and then also still have that kind of rigor and that precise quality of the math and engineering behind all of the spacing and ratios. So that basically culminated into just doing a lot of prototyping with the actual teams. This was from our security team doing some data viz work with one of their products. And basically, this is what the system produces, is a set of different experiences from end to end, which could be software, like many of the examples I'm showing you, or it could be an event like this capsule that we built for the Watson Primer event at one of our recent conferences. It could be a website. It could even just be a piece of copy, like with Watson, which basically is a very inclusive way of expressing how we want to relate to the people that we're serving. Through the photography, through, again, the conferences that we would host. And so essentially we use the same grid for the keynote presentations as we do for software products. And make that kind of an extensible thing that can work for any surface or medium. So yeah, I just want to leave you with this nice thought from our CEO, who basically wanted us to really ask ourselves, if the people who are engaging with IBM are no longer necessarily interfacing with an IBMer first, then how could the system that we build really put forward an experience that still felt like you were engaging with an IBMer. And like I said, we did this project, this evolution, and this philosophy together with our content team, our brand team, our product team, and our web team. So I think that it's important to highlight that, just to say that, we needed people from all design disciplines to collaborate together to achieve that, and that interdisciplinary approach to design mediums is a perfect example of what designers need to prepare in the future. So I want to just get back to this question about design systems replacing designers. I want to just cover what's called the Designer of 2025 report and highlight a few things here for you. So Adam Michaela, who is credited with starting design systems at Facebook and Airbnb, recently was quoted on designsystems.com as saying that many of today's designers must be content assembling pre-designed components, a task that will increasingly become automated. Or they will need to gain more general skills to fill higher level functions in an organization. But my question is, what skills is he actually talking about that we're going to need? So according to this Designer of 2025 study that was done by the American Institute of Graphic Arts in 2017, steered by a Doctor of Design, Meredith Davis, there are 6 trends that are shaping the skills that designers are going to need in the future. The first trend is complexity. So complex problems are increasingly being situated within larger systems that are characterized by different interdependent relationships between the physical, the psychological, the social, the cultural, the technological, the economic, and in their effects, they require very, very interdisciplinary expertise. So constraints compete for priority with complexity and are unstable in their influence on the problem situation. So every time that something changes in a complex system, it reconfigures other things in the system, making it more complicated. Methods of working, different skills and behaviors like you're seeing here, are developed for solving complex problems, which are different than solving simple problems and require expertise from many different fields. So basically, in sum, that just means get ready to work with people that have a very different expertise than you and embrace that change. A second one is aggregation and curation. This is essentially a way in which the trend being that third parties are assembling and representing messages, products, and services from all different kinds of sources. In some cases, aggregation enhances experiences by bridging gaps between related information and activities. And in other cases, filter bubbles actually limit our exposure to a variety of ideas as algorithms selectively guess what information users would like to see on the basis of location, history, or some past behavior or preference. So, as users, we oftentimes shorten or trim down different aggregates based on what our needs and interests are, and we don't care where those sources necessarily came from or always have the integrity of the information in mind. This basically means that, diminished brand awareness and communication fragmentation occur because these original sources lose control over the context in which their messages are seen and heard. There's essentially a set of design trends, and I just listed a couple of them here, but there are about 7 of them in total. I want to highlight them again, which are complexity, aggregation and curation, new forms of sense-making, resilient organizations, accountability for predicting outcomes of design action, and the idea that core values matter. And I want to really, I wanted to cover these in more detail, but for the sake of time, I just want to say that if you go and Google the AIGA Designer of 2025 report, you can see almost 50 different skills and behaviors that will prepare designers for the future. So last but not least, I just have a question for you. Raise your hand if you think the answer to this question is yes. Raise your hand if you think the answer is no. Okay, I agree. Design systems won't replace the need for designers, but design systems will change the demand for the type of designer that's needed. So ultimately, in order for design systems to not replace designers, we need to focus on what makes us essential for the future. Thanks.